at least if you are acquiring stuff either by the government or on behalf of the U.S. government. Say you're a contractor or a subcontractor. And it turns out that their definition of commercial says if it has at least one non-government use and it's licensed to the public, it is commercial. There's actually a lot of other reasons for it to be commercial too, but that's sufficient. It turns out practically all open source software projects have at least one non-government use, and obviously they're licensed to the public. Therefore, they're commercial by definition. You don't believe me there? Well, that only applies to the U.S. federal government. Well, how about the U.S. copyright law, which applies to anything in the U.S. government? It turns out they have a definition for financial gain, but their definition of financial gain says the receipt or expectation of future receipt of anything of value, including other copyrighted works, which is why open source software projects generally establish websites and mailing lists, because they want to encourage contributions back. So as far as the U.S. government is concerned, they're already engaged in financial gain. It may not be in dollars, it's barter essentially in many cases, but that's still financial gain. Sounds commercial to me. And of course, lots and lots of businesses do this. There's lots of different business models. Don't have time to talk about all of them, and in particular, I want to throw in at least one last thing here before I go. I want to beat up another common term that I've heard, and I've heard it today, I've heard it other places. And I found while collecting some of the numbers stuff, there was a lot of misconceptions. I've decided some of this at least comes back to a very, very misleading term that a lot of lawyers have started to fling around called intellectual property. It sounds so banal. What's so big a deal? Well, it turns out, what do they mean? Usually when they say intellectual property or intellectual property rights, they're talking about a set of laws, copyright laws, patent laws, trademark laws, trade secret laws. The problem is the phrase intellectual property is fundamentally and deeply misleading. Okay? If I take your car, you have no car. Physical property, we understand. The problem is that when we use the word property, we think, at least in general, most English speakers immediately move on to thinking the same notions as physical property. But this isn't physical property. If I copy your software, you still have the software. The formal economic term for this, by the way, is a non-rivalrous good. Any intellectual work like software, books, and so on are fundamentally non-rivalrous. They don't work like cars and most physical properties. And in fact, the riprap folks are having more interesting issues because they're talking about physical properties. They're starting to have the properties of the software. And oh my goodness, the intellectual property issues there, when you use this phrase intellectual property, is just astounding. This failure to understand the difference between a physical work and a not physical work leads to a lot of mistaken thinking, because knowledge and physical properties are fundamentally different. And this is a problem for open source software. It's also a problem, it turns out, by the way, for government contracts, because really, oftentimes, what you care about are the rights, not the property. Okay? And after all, the U.S. Constitution permits exclusive rights only for a limited time and only for a specific purpose. Really, say intellectual rights or intellectual works. It's going to be better for you because all of a sudden, understanding things like government contracts and open source software becomes a lot clearer and say, well, what are my rights? What are your rights? Oh, wait a minute. I'm not trying to figure out who owns what. I'm trying to figure out who has which rights. All right, parting comments. I have shown some of my numbers. I've got lots more. Okay, the URL that I cited, I don't remember how many pages it is now. It depends, of course, on your printer, but it's over 100 pages of the stats and little comments about them, what they are, and so on. And I'm about to release another version of it. So the short answer, though, you don't have to read every stat to know that FLOSS in many cases have measurable advantages over their proprietary competition. Okay? And that means that you should consider FLOSS software when acquiring it. Just from my numbers, I can't prove that a particular open source software program is better than all others. Okay? But I can show you that it's very much worth considering. Now, if you're involved in any business or government, I can make some additional appeals to you. First of all, basically don't disadvantage FLOSS in your policies. Okay, if anything, advantage it. It has some real advantages. So beware of vendor lock-in. Prefer open standards, because open standards make it a lot easier to switch. One of the reasons that programs like OpenSSH managed to very quickly take over and to a certain extent web browsers also, is because they were implementing open standards. If you're not locked into a vendor's proprietary format, it's a lot easier to switch to another product, including an open source software product or a FLOSS product. Okay? So you should prefer them so that you're not locked into them. And by open standards, I mean publicly held, multi-vendor support. They don't require patents to implement. Beware of a lot of vendor pays assumptions. And this is particularly an issue in the US federal government. There's something called the Common Criteria for Evaluating Security, where the government, when it set up the program, assumed that the vendors were all going to pay for the evaluation. And all the open source developers are saying, well, you're talking about an improvement. We'd be delighted to help you pay for the evaluation. The government said, but you pay. Why are we paying? We're not the ones who need the evaluation. You're the one who wants the evaluation. Why aren't you doing the evaluation? And so you end up with this unfortunate circumstance in many cases. Frankly, are software patents justified? There's a question mark there. I actually have an answer. The answer is no. Okay? Software patents are and have been a disaster in the US for quite some time. Many other countries forbid them for good reason. And the US actually, the US software industry was actually doing better when we didn't have software patents, but the lawyers like software patents because they make a lot of money on them. And unfortunately, that has really caused a lot of harm in the industry, and I'll be delighted to get rid of them if we ever do. So, for more detailed information, there's a URL, and I am just under the wire. I think I can take one or two questions. Okay, excellent. Mad Dog.
I have one comment on your reliability slides.
Oh.
And you're talking about reliability of products that are still in warranty or products that are still receiving support from the proprietary vendors. If you're trying to use a product which is no longer supported by the proprietary vendor, you'll never get the patch. I can actually point to some exceptions, but they're the exceptions that prove the rule too. You're right. Once it goes beyond warranty, now in some cases, the solution is open up your wallet and just pour out the money. And the danger, of course, is that in some cases, it doesn't matter how much you're willing to pay. If the vendors decide they don't want to support that product anymore, you can be in serious trouble because now you not only have you don't have the reliability even if you're willing to pay extra for it. The thing is, in certain cases, you're bound by the hardware which you have, which the new software doesn't support. So in the case of various banks down in Brazil, they were using OS2 as the operating system for their ATM machines. Okay. And when a certain large company decided they weren't going to support that anymore, they could no longer get patches for it or anything else.
Right, right. And actually, IBM actually supported OS2 far longer than most companies would have. So, even you could argue that IBM was on the side of angels, and yet, eventually, the customers got hurt. Even with, frankly, there's a lot of companies that are even more evil, or far worse, not more evil, that's probably not fair, but have done far worse things to their customers.
I was working at DEC when when a very well-known worm came out that was attacking Unix systems.
I remember it.
It took us 2 weeks to generate the binary patch, to test it, distribute it to our customers. The open source community had a source code patch out about 4 hours after the product was understood. So that was 1 week, 6 days, and 21 hours earlier. So. Right,
right. And that's actually been repeated many times. People have sometimes even been trying to produce patches for Windows or for Internet Explorer without the code, and that's a rough road to hoe. You're not sure what, whereas again, the open source folks, I think that's a good deal of why, for example, the browser unsafe days are so much smaller for Firefox. Because if there's a problem, they can quit, either the folks inside Mozilla or frankly anybody else in the world can analyze it, figure it out, produce it, submit it to Mozilla, they check it and send it right out. It doesn't have to be the cabal of 3 people who are the only 3 who can understand it. Yes?
So I don't remember who first made the observation, but one of the things I found interesting in a report a year or 2 ago was the observation that of all of the CERT advisories that had been issued in the last couple of years, and analysis of them, pointed out that virtually all of the advisories that had gone out about Linux and other open source technologies were defects that had been discovered by analysis of the source code, and that in fact, at the time the CERT advisories went out and these problems were being fixed, that in almost every case it was an unexploited defect that had been observed and was hideous enough that once it was understood, it needed attention and to be repaired. While in the proprietary platforms, the vast majority of the advisories had gone out about problems which had first been exposed through active exploits.
Right, right, and that's
It just was an interesting sort of
right.
distinction.
And I actually don't think these two are different at all, because what happens is, when an exploit gets found, often, not always, but often there's a delay before it's exploited. It's found and then exploited. If you, as soon as you find it, you fix it. That's a completely different model. You found, somebody found it, they're going to make money off it, exploiting it, and then finally somebody finds out about it and fixes it. But I think that's a fair point. And again, the whole notion, remarkably, I still hear a lot of people saying, well, isn't open source less secure? No, more secure. In fact, the MITRE back in 2003 found that DoD was using open source quite heavily, specifically in security, because they needed to be able to respond to attacks. And because they could make changes for new and novel attacks, which unfortunately DoD has to deal with, by golly, they could, they had control. They could make rapid changes and deal with problems instead of waiting for a vendor who may or may not fix it and certainly won't do it on the scale that they need it and speed they need it. Do we have time, or is that it? Who's my clock? All right, my watch says 1 more minute. So let's do one more question and then we'll close whatever that is. No. Okay, thank you very, very much. We are done. Thank you. Okay, I hope it helped.
Yeah, but I was hoping for practical examples, but
Well, I think got more stuff in there.
Well, I mean.